Hello and welcome to the 11th part in our study in John's Gospel. We are here towards the very end of the Gospel in chapter 18 as the story of Jesus' betrayal, arrest and trial unfolds. Jesus steps outside with his disciples, having spoken many words of discourse, this great prayer of unity, and now the rest of this the gospel really puts that into very real practical application, in which Jesus, having told his disciples that he must die, he must glorify God in that way, to demonstrate to them his power in humility over life and death, so bringing in this age of new life which he has promised to them and to us. Notice that he goes out and he's in a garden, and John is keen to point that out. And I think we're put in mind again of Genesis, when Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Delight. But here they're in the garden which we call Gethsemane. I think it's interesting too that John acknowledges that Judas has this shared knowledge with Jesus. They both know of the garden. They know it's a place where Jesus will be present, and so that there's almost there a hint that Jesus is still in control of the situation. This is still in accordance with his will, because he knows that it is only in death that he will finally glorify his Father. But there's already hints that things are not quite as Jesus would have them. So Judas brings a detachment of soldiers, and they're coming with lanterns and torches and weapons. They're having to create their own light. Jesus is the light, and he's invited the disciples to share in that. Judas chooses not to. He goes and fetches his own lights, torches, lanterns. We know John mixes the physical and the spiritual, and encourages us to interpret both. And Jesus says to them, John 18:5, "I am he." Again, I think when we hear those words, "I am," we should be put in mind that Jesus is identifying with the very presence, the very existence of God. And indeed, there's a physical response to that. So the people who are with him step back and fall to the ground. That's an act of worship, that fall to the ground. It actually reflects a Hebrew word, hishtachoah, which is a very specific word for an act of obeisance, an act of worship, which is a unique form in Hebrew. It's not used for any other Hebrew word. So it's a very unique way of saying that Jesus is the object of a biblical form of worship reserved only for God. And Jesus is the true object of that worship. And indeed, he says, John says, this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." When those two phrases come together, fulfilled and word, and the word for word is logos. So when the logos has been fulfilled or completed, you can see we're moving towards the conclusion of everything that John has been building up to. So the soldiers with the police arrest Jesus and take him to first to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And Caiaphas is the one who had said that it was better to have one person die for the people. I wonder if what John's doing here is sort of sowing the seeds of truth in the world. Again, he's acknowledging that Jesus came to sanctify the whole world, and so those seeds of truth are there. They just need encouragement, nurturing, and being allowed to bear fruit. Caiaphas is the one who said it was better to have one person die for the people, and that's exactly what Jesus is going to do, if only we can help them to understand that that is indeed Jesus' role. That's against Peter, who ought to recognise the truth, and yet in this little part of the narrative, Jesus actually condemns and excludes himself. So he has this invitation to stay with Jesus and go into the inner courtyard of the high priest. But he stays outside, and the other disciple, who is known to the high priest, comes out and gets him. "Come with me." And the woman who's guarding the gate says, "Are you one of his disciples?" And he says, "I'm not." So Peter, who has only got an invitation into the court of the high priest because he's a disciple of Jesus, denies that very invitation is valid. He condemns, he excludes himself. But actually, is Jesus allowing him to do that for a reason? Because then when Pilate questions him and about his disciples, Jesus says, "Why don't you ask my disciples about me? They will testify to the truth." But he knows Peter won't, and Peter didn't. Peter denied knowing Jesus. Is that Peter's get out, so that Peter is not condemned alongside him by Pilate, by the Jewish authorities? I wonder if there's an example of God using our mistakes, using the times that we feel we've let him down, even then, to bring life and light to the world, if we allow him to. I think there's a very real example of lived redemption and reconciliation in what happens to Peter there. Jesus is taken then away from the Jewish authorities to Pilate. John reaffirms, as we said he will do many times, the chronology here. It was early in the morning, and it has not been the Passover yet. We've had the meal, it's not the Passover. That's John's chronology, and he wants us to know that. Why? Because he wants us to know that it's the death, the crucifixion, that is the sacrament of the Passover, not the meal. Even though the symbolism of the bread and the wine is important. And I think that's why John has sort of obscured his Eucharistic and baptismal descriptions throughout the Gospel, and never says, "I'm talking about the Eucharist." Why? Because he wants us to see baptism and Eucharist as sacraments of crucifixion and resurrection, sacraments of the Passover, but in that act of death and new life. So he doesn't want to describe the meal. He doesn't want us to focus on that part of the narrative. He wants us to remember that the meal is an invitation to participate in death and resurrection, just as baptism is. So that's why everything in John has been leading up to this moment of crucifixion, when he will say, "It is finished. Now it is complete." And that is something we ought to be able to say every Eucharist and every baptism. But before we get there, we have this contrast of Jesus' spiritual authority with Pilate struggling with his earthly authority and earthly judgment. So you have Pilate sort of testing him, asserting that he has power to free him or put him to death. He tries to hand him over to the people, exert his authority over the people. There's a big power struggle here, and Pilate can sort of see what's going on, but Jesus allows it to happen. He knows that his power, his spiritual power, comes in accepting death. Pilate tests Jesus' understanding of kingship, and I think what we're getting here is Pilate is going to be able to testify to the truth as Jesus invites him to. That's why Pilate is able to write on the cross, "the King of the Jews," and defends that is what he has written. He is learning to testify here. So I think, again, I think there's an interesting example of reconciliation in Pilate's story, as well as in Peter's story here in John's Gospel. But in the end, he comes to his own decision that about Jesus, and so all he can say when he brings him out and hands him over to the people is in 19:5. Here is the man, ecce homo in Latin, which has become a sort of icon of defining the humanity of Jesus. Here is the man. Here is the one whom you are putting to death. The one who I can see truth in, but I'm allowing him to accept his fate in humility. I think that's a real moment of recognition and reconciliation for Pilate. Pilate, though, acts out of fear particularly of what the crowd will do, fear of his own judgment, and perhaps fear of what God will do for him. Jesus does not act out of fear. Jesus' power comes out of humility. And I think that's important, that we don't act out of fear. Perfect love, John says in his letters, drives out fear. And here we get a real example of that Pilate doesn't accept that. Pilate acts out of fear. I think there's an irony then in what the crowd asked Pilate to do. Away with him, they say. Take him away to crucify him. That's exactly what Jesus has said he's going to do. He's going to go away to his Father. But he has to allow the crowd the power to say that themselves. Take him away with him. That is what Jesus is going to do, but not, as so often, in the way that they expect. So Pilate does nail that inscription. His testimony is in writing, in Latin, in Greek, in Hebrew, in the languages in which the scriptures were circulated, the languages of the Middle East of that time. Pilate's testimony is in writing, in the same way that John's testimony is. I think there's a real redemption arc for Pilate in John's Gospel. Those relationships continue. Jesus sets up the ways in which his disciples will care for one another, including for his own mother, who's had that role back at Cana at the wedding. She has a role now of standing by, and if only she could remember those words, do whatever he tells you. Well, he's not going to tell them to do much more. He's allowed them to be the ones giving the orders. But what will he tell them? That it is finished. Those are the words which come from his mouth. And those are the words which Mary would instruct us to hear, to believe, to have faith in. And that is where we leave the narrative of Jesus' death. A moment of completion, a moment of glory, but not in the way that we would expect. The writer says that he who saw this has testified so that you may also believe. He knows that why this is all written down, why this is recorded, is for testimony and remembrance, so that we may hold on to the truth, hold on to the life that comes from participating in the life of Christ. And in that respect, the story is finished. The work is finished. But of course there is more to come. There is one more session on chapters 20 and 21. The work may be finished, but the new life of love is just beginning. But we'll come to that next time. God bless you, and I look forward to sharing the last two chapters of John's Gospel with you too.